A phone is shaking in her hands. Her breathing is uneven. Her voice is low, frightened, and breaking apart with every word. Somewhere inside a moving car, a 21-year-old mother is whispering to 911 that she has been kidnapped. She is alive. She is still fighting. She is trying to tell them enough to find her before it is too late. And that is what makes this story so terrifying. This was not a case where nobody knew she was in danger. Denise Amber Lee found a way to call for help. A witness also saw something was wrong and called too. For a brief moment, there was still hope. There was still time. There was still a chance that someone could reach her. But they did not. Welcome back to the channel. If you are drawn to true crime stories that stay with you long after the video ends, make sure you subscribe, because this case is one of the most heartbreaking and haunting stories we have ever covered. And as you listen, tell me this in the comments. What is more terrifying to you? A crime with no clues, or a crime where help was almost close enough to save the victim? Denise Amber Lee was only 21 years old. She was a young mother of 2 little boys, living in Northport, Florida. She was not famous. She was not living some dangerous double life. She was simply a young woman trying to build a life, care for her children, and move through an ordinary day. That is one of the reasons this case hits so hard. It began in the middle of regular life. No warning. No sign that anything was about to go terribly wrong. Just a normal day that turned into a nightmare. On January 17, 2008, Denise was at home with her children. It was broad daylight, the kind of time when most people feel safe enough not to think twice about the world outside their door. But sometime that day, a man named Michael Lee King entered her world and destroyed it. He abducted Denise from her home, taking her by force and leaving her children behind. That detail alone is devastating. Her children were still there in the home, while their mother was being taken away. Imagine how sudden that must have been. Imagine the confusion, the fear, the violence of those moments. Denise did not leave by choice. She was ripped away from the place where she should have been safest. But as horrifying as the abduction was, that was only the beginning of what made this case unforgettable. Because Denise was still alive after she was taken. She was still conscious. She was still trying to survive. And while she was trapped inside Michael King's vehicle, she somehow managed to get hold of a phone and call 911. Think about what that means. She had just been abducted. She was in the presence of the man who had taken her. She had no idea what he was planning to do to her. And yet, in the middle of that terror, she found a way to reach out for help. She found a way to use her voice when most people would have been frozen with fear. That one moment changed the entire meaning of the case. Because now this was no longer just a murder investigation waiting to happen. It was an active emergency. Denise was still alive. She was reaching the outside world. If the response moved fast enough, if the information was shared clearly enough, if people acted with urgency, there was still a chance to save her. And she was not the only one trying to make that happen. At around the same time, a witness named Jane Kowalski noticed that something was seriously wrong. She reportedly heard screams coming from the car. She saw Denise in distress and understood that this was not an argument or some misunderstanding. This was a woman in danger. And instead of looking away, she followed the vehicle and called 911 herself. Now there were 2 lifelines. The victim had called for help, and a witness had called for help. That is what makes everything that came next so difficult to accept. Because there was still a chance. There was still a moving vehicle on the road. There was still a woman alive inside it. There were still people trying to get that information to the authorities. This was not one of those cases where everyone learned the truth only after it was too late. For a brief period, this was a rescue that might still have happened. But minute by minute, that chance started slipping away. And this is where the story becomes even more heartbreaking. The emergency calls were coming in, but the response did not come together the way it needed to. Critical information was not handled with the speed and coordination the situation demanded. Communication failures between dispatchers and law enforcement created delays. In an ordinary situation, a delay might mean frustration. In a kidnapping, a delay can mean death. That is the terrible reality of this case. Denise was doing everything she could to survive. A witness was doing everything she could to help. but the system around them was not moving fast enough to catch up. As Michael Lee King kept driving, Denise's window of survival kept shrinking. It is hard to imagine what those moments must have felt like for her. She had already been taken from her home. She had already been torn away from her children. And now she was trapped in a vehicle with a man who had complete control over where she was going and what would happen next. At the same time, she knew help might be possible. She had made the call. She had reached someone. She had done what she was supposed to do. That may be the most painful part of all. She did what people are told to do in an emergency. She called 911.
She tried to speak.
She tried to hold on long enough for someone to find her. But the rescue never came in time. And that is why people still talk about Denise Amber Lee's case with so much emotion. It is not only because the crime was brutal. It is because it felt so close to ending differently. At this point in the story, there was still movement, still uncertainty, still a chance that somehow the police would get there before the worst happened. But that chance disappeared when Michael King took Denise to his home. That was the moment the danger became even more severe. At his house, Denise was sexually assaulted and murdered. Later, King buried her body in a remote area, trying to hide what he had done. It was an act of cruelty, violence, and finality. He had taken a young mother from her home in broad daylight and then tried to erase her life, as though it meant nothing. But Denise was not erased. Because before Michael King killed her, she had already done something that made this case impossible to forget. She had reached the outside world. She had made contact. Her fear, her courage, and her final attempt to survive had already become part of the record. And that changed everything. Police moved quickly in the aftermath. Michael Lee King was arrested that same day. The evidence against him built rapidly. Witness accounts, physical evidence, and forensic findings all pointed directly to him. This was not a mystery in the usual sense. Investigators did not spend years trying to figure out who was responsible. They knew who had done it. But even that brought very little comfort. Because the question was never only who killed Denise Amber Lee. The real question was why she was not saved while she was still alive. That is the question that has haunted this case from the beginning. In 2009, Michael Lee King was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. He was sentenced to death. On paper, that sounds like justice moving as firmly as possible. The killer was identified. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. He received the harshest penalty the state could impose. But for many people, that was never enough to quiet the pain of this case. A conviction can answer the legal question. It cannot undo a missed opportunity. And that missed opportunity became one of the most important parts of Denise's legacy. As the investigation and public discussion continued, serious concerns were raised about the handling of the 911 calls. The issue was not that nobody cared. The issue was that the emergency response system did not function with the precision that a case like this required. Information was delayed. Communication broke down. And those failures mattered because Denise was still alive while those calls were being made. This was not just a murder story anymore. It had become a story about what happens when someone reaches for help and the system fails to respond quickly enough. That is a different kind of fear. A lot of true crime stories are frightening because they show how dangerous one violent person can be. Denise's story is frightening for that reason too, but it goes further. It also shows how terrifying it can be when a victim does everything right and still cannot be saved. That idea stays with people. It makes the case feel personal. It makes people imagine themselves in that same position, doing everything they're supposed to do, hoping the call will bring rescue, only for time to run out. That is why this story never really faded. And it is also why Denise's family refused to let her death become just another headline. Her husband, Nathan Lee, became a major force in preserving her memory and turning the tragedy into reform. Through his advocacy, Denise's case helped inspire changes in Florida's emergency response system. The Denise Amber Lee Act established stronger training standards for 911 dispatchers, and the Denise Amber Lee Foundation was created to push for better emergency preparedness and telecommunicator training. That part of the story matters deeply. Because while nothing can ever undo what happened to Denise, her death did lead to changes that may help save other lives. That is one of the few things that gives this case any sense of lasting purpose. Her final attempt to get help became part of a larger effort to make sure emergency systems perform better for the next person in danger. Still, there is something deeply tragic about that kind of reform. It always comes too late for the person whose suffering made it necessary. Denise had to be lost before people truly understood how dangerous those gaps in communication could be. And maybe that is one of the hardest truths in all of true crime. Sometimes a case does not expose a broken system until the damage is already irreversible. If you are still with me, take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel, and it helps more people discover stories that deserve to be told with care and respect. And I want to know your thoughts so far. Do you think the most painful part of this story is what Michael King did, or the fact that Denise had a chance to be saved? Let me know in the comments. What makes Denise Amber Lee's case especially haunting is how simple the core story is. A young mother was abducted from her home in broad daylight. She called 911 from inside the kidnapper's car. A witness also called 911 after seeing she was in danger. There was still time, and yet she was not rescued. You do not need a complicated twist to make that terrifying. In fact, the simplicity is what makes it hit so hard. There is no maze to get lost in, no mystery to soften the blow. Just a straight line from danger to possible rescue to devastating failure. That is why people remember it. And that is why the case surged back into public attention years later. On March 17, 2026, Michael Lee King was executed in Florida. That event brought Denise Amber Lee's story back into the news and back into public conversation. A whole new wave of people discovered the case, while others were reminded of just how heartbreaking it had always been. And the same reaction kept appearing again and again. Disbelief, anger, heartbreak. Because even after all these years, the central fact still feels impossible to accept. Denise called for help. She was heard. And she still did not make it home. That is the sentence that defines this case. Not just that she was murdered, but that she was so close to rescue. It is one thing to hear about a crime where no one knew what was happening until afterward. It is another thing entirely to hear about a case where the victim was alive, the danger was known, and the response still failed to arrive in time. That is what makes this story feel less like a mystery and more like a nightmare unfolding in real time. And at the center of that nightmare is Denise herself, a 21-year-old mother who, in the middle of terror, still fought to be found. That courage should not be lost in the details of what went wrong. Denise was not passive in her final hours. She resisted. She reached out. She tried to survive. She forced a connection with the outside world under unimaginable circumstances. And that makes her story not only tragic, but deeply human. It is also why her case should be told carefully. Too often, true crime content can become obsessed with the killer, the brutality, or the shock value. But Denise Amber Lee's story is not strongest when it focuses on the man who killed her. It is strongest when it focuses on Denise, on the rescue that almost happened, and on the lessons her death forced people to confront. Because that is where the emotional truth lives. Michael Lee King was the man who committed the crime. But the reason this case became unforgettable is that Denise had a chance. A small chance. A fragile chance. But a real one. And that chance was lost. As terrible as the crime itself was, that detail is what keeps this story alive in the minds of so many people. It is why her name still carries such emotional weight. It is why the title, the 911 call that still terrifies people, does not feel exaggerated. If anything, it feels painfully accurate. This case forces people to think about something they would rather believe is certain, that when someone calls 911, help will come fast enough. Denise Amber Lee's story challenged that belief. And that is why it remains one of the most haunting true crime cases in America. Because it touches a fear that goes beyond violence. It touches the fear of being heard and still being lost. That is the kind of story that stays with people. Not because it is sensational, but because it feels so painfully possible. A home, a mother, a car on the road, a phone call, a witness trying to help. A rescue that almost happened, and then silence. Before we close, I want to say this clearly. Denise Amber Lee was more than the worst thing that happened to her. She was a young woman with a family, children who needed her, and a life that should have stretched far beyond that January afternoon. The fact that her name is now connected to reform and emergency training says something powerful about the impact she continues to have. Even in death, her story helped protect others. But that does not erase the heartbreak. Nothing does. Because, in the end, the most painful truth about Denise Amber Lee is also the simplest one. She should have made it home. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more true crime cases told with depth, emotion, and respect. Leave a like if you want to support the channel, and comment below with the next case you want me to cover. Denise Amber Lee called for help. The world heard her. And that is exactly why nobody has forgotten her.